lot of data, but hopefully can give you some helpful reflections based upon really 25 years experience of engaging with the private sector in different ways in terms of this journey of environmental awareness and sustainability, which has become so embedded in recent years. Excuse me. Just in terms of my background and experiences on these subjects, I've been involved in different phases of the sustainability discussion going back about a quarter of a century, and spent 18 years of that working with Friends of the Earth, various campaign issues. I was the campaigns director there for 6 years, and then finally the director of the UK operation and the vice chair of Friends of the Earth International. And so had quite a lot of experience of engaging with companies on a wide range of issues, from chemicals, waste, biodiversity, climate change, of course, and in a wide range of different tactical engagements, if you like, from bringing legal actions to doing consumer campaigns to running boycotts, through to positive engagement and encouraging companies to do the right thing for the right kinds of reasons. And today I'm still very much involved with talking to companies, both as an advisor to a few firms who I work with on an ongoing basis, and also through my work with the Cambridge University Programme for Sustainability Leadership, which I would encourage you to Google and just have a look at some of the work we're doing there and encouraging leadership in a way which is perhaps taking us on to the next stage. And that next stage of corporate environmentalism I will talk about in a few moments, but I thought it might be helpful to begin just by reviewing very briefly the journey that has taken place over the last 30-odd years, because we didn't finish up where we are now just by everybody suddenly going green. It's been quite a struggle and actually quite a dynamic process that's brought us to the present point. So, Ros, I wonder if you'd be kind enough to put the first slide there, please, and we can have a quick look at that. So I'm just going to show you three very simple slides, really, which will chart in a very broad way where we've come from in terms of corporate environmental engagement, where, broadly speaking, we've reached now the present situation, and then to make some points about the future, and maybe that will be the basis for our discussion later on. So if I'm thinking back to the late 1980s, or indeed to the 1990s, I have recollections of engaging with companies, indeed reporters, for example, people writing for the Financial Times and Telegraph, who, actively resisted the idea that the environmental or indeed sustainability agenda, as it later transformed into, was anything to do with business. And, their view was that the business of business is business, and, wealth creation needs to be the top priority of companies, and that they shouldn't be distracted by worrying about issues that weren't really in their competence or in their sphere of influence. And, these things were relegated to the margins of business practice and were deemed to be the realm of government, or indeed the consumer, insofar as they were accepted at all. And of course there was at that time a great deal of resistance to the notion that there was indeed even a crisis, and the climate change issue was actively denied in public by a lot of companies who claimed there was no evidence for the phenomenon, and therefore there was no basis for taking action. Insofar as there was an acceptance that some consumers might like to be going greener, this was something that was very much left to the market. And I remember engaging with another company executives who said, well, if people want to buy this stuff, then they can go and buy it from one of our competitors who may or may not supply it. But at the moment we don't supply it because we don't see a consumer demand. Therefore, we see no legitimate reason for us to supply something that presently, isn't something that we do. And so, the market excuse was kind of put there as a reason, one reason why companies shouldn't act. People aren't demanding it, therefore we've no reason to supply it. And there were also a great many what you might recall lobbies of resistance who were out there blocking regulation. And I remember this in relation to recycling, waste, chemicals, forestry, mining, lots of different lobby groups who were in the business of stopping government action in order to preserve the kind of free market economic environment that had become so ideologically associated with successful business in those days in the late 80s and early 1990s. And I think probably the one that really struck me as a particularly dangerous and unfortunate grouping was the so-called Global Climate Coalition, which up until the late 1990s was actively campaigning on the international stage, and particularly successfully in the United States, to stop countries agreeing a new international treaty on climate change. And I engaged with those people very actively at the time of the Kyoto Climate Change Summit to expose the level of lobbying that was going on to convince governments that they didn't have a role in putting in place legally binding frameworks to cut carbon dioxide emissions. And of course, we've just had the failure of the Copenhagen summit, and one wonders how much of that was to do with different business lobbies in different parts of the world still making similar points. And so these company resistance lobbies were out there blocking regulation, and one of the things they did quite effectively was to use what turned out to be spurious arguments that inflated the costs of action. And so, the famous numbers being put out there by different companies claiming that it would lead to an economic catastrophe in certain sectors to eliminate the chemicals that were destroying the ozone layer. This was a very active debate during the late 80s and early 1990s. Of course, in the end, the science won that argument and governments did intervene. But if you look across a whole range of sectors to do with clean air, chemicals, recycling, whatever it happens to be, you find that there are big numbers put out there in terms of job losses and costs that ultimately were proved wrong, but which nonetheless did influence the political discussion. There's a famous report, or at least a very good report, that I came across some years ago called Cry Wolf, which is an academic piece of work that goes into the claims made by industry in relation to various proposed environmental regulations, and shows how, they not only massively overestimated the costs of particular regulatory controls, for example, on chemical releases, but also dramatically underestimated the business opportunities of regulations creating new product lines and new ways of generating wealth. And so, that was something that characterized the environmental debate for a long period up until at least the mid-1990s, and actually in some cases still continues. So insofar as there was any action in those days, and I'm talking broadly, of course there were leaders and there were companies doing things differently, but the trend at that time was to see environmental responsibility basically matching regulatory compliance. And if there was anything that was going beyond regulatory compliance, it was about, for example, risky liabilities. And I remember engaging with banks in the early 1990s who, claimed to have good environmental policies, but basically what they were saying was they were scrutinizing, their investments and portfolios, looking for risk. For example, contaminated land that might be sold onto a housing developer, be shown to be unsuitable for housing, big costs on the housing developer that then might turn into a legal claim against the people who sold the land. All these kinds of things were used to frame the environmental debate, and there were a few voluntary codes. Some groups, the paper industry, chemicals industry, were using voluntary codes which evidently were up there to avoid regulatory frameworks. They weren't really driving things much further forward, but were rather weak and non-specific guidelines which could be held up to policymakers to say, look, we don't need to be regulated here because actually we've already got this voluntary code in place. So that, I think, summarizes my kind of experience over quite a long period, from the late 80s at least to the mid-1990s, and indeed up until quite recently in some sectors and in some cases. But things did begin to change in the mid-1990s, and if we see the next slide, Roz, maybe we could just have a look. So the mid-1990s saw the emergence of this framework for environmental engagement, which was a step forward, which became known as corporate social responsibility. And this was an agenda that emerged from several different factors. But I think on the environmental side, the thing that really would be the kind of watershed that marked the emergence of this new period was the Brent Spar campaign being run by Greenpeace against the Shell Corporation, who wanted to ditch a piece of oil industry equipment in the North Atlantic, and it was a storage buoy, a big piece of metal with a level of contamination that became controversial. But irrespective of the controversies about how much environmental impact it would have caused, what it did do was to position the Shell brand in a very public way as being environmentally damaging. And of course, at the same time, there was the scandal in Nigeria with the murder of various activists by the Nigerian government that also put pressure on the Shell Corporation, and which led to this really dramatic rebranding away from the idea that, you know, this was the price of progress, broadly speaking, the idea of ditching things in the sea, to put the company in a new place where the rhetoric was much more about profits and principles, and, you know, the idea that there didn't need to be a choice between, on the one hand, profitability and normal business, and on the other, having high principles for environmental protection. There was all sorts of other things going on in this period, the idea of the triple bottom line about how companies could, you know, meet increasingly demanding environmental goals at the same time as having, you know, shareholder value and social performance. And there were new groupings that began to emerge. In fact, the WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, came from the time of the Rio Summit in the early 1990s, but was beginning to build momentum, more of a public profile, using this idea that the market could deliver and that voluntary action in this, you know, new CSR kind of environment could deliver on what increasingly was becoming a strong demand from the public. You know, and the pressure groups were becoming very effective around this time, and I was running one, Friends of the Earth, well, the campaigns department at least, and then later became director in this period. And, you know, we started to get some real purchase on companies. And, you know, not only were those the specialist organizations like the World Business Council, but also some of the other groupings that had previously been pretty skeptical about the idea of environmental action being a core business concern, like the Confederation of British Industry and the World Economic Forum. They began to engage with the issues as well in quite a strategic way.